about is Serbian nationalism. So Serbia was divided between the Holy Roman Empire and the Ottoman Empire, between what ultimately became Austria and what ultimately became Turkey. Like most of these other groups, the Serbians rise up against colonial rule in 1848, but they fail. Nevertheless, it sort of begins a process by which they begin to agitate for rights and independence. This is accomplished somewhat in 1882 with the establishment of a Kingdom of Serbia, but a very large percentage of Serbians still live outside the borders of that kingdom. And it's really for that reason that violence continues. So the organization that we're talking about tonight is called the Black Hand, and it is also known as Unity or Death, is the way that it's referred to in your, or Union and Death, as it's referred to in your textbook. It's founded in 1901, and it undertakes terrorist actions and guerrilla fighting to secure the independence of other areas where Serbs are living to be annexed to the Kingdom of Serbia. Austria responds to this by blockading Serbia in 1906 and subsequently annexing an area called Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is an independent country today. And the reason why Austria annexes it, this is formerly governed by the Ottoman Empire. Austria annexes it as the Ottoman Empire has already begun a process of contracting and getting smaller in size. The Greeks have already won their independence at this point almost 100 years earlier, and other groups in the Balkans in particular are agitating for and successfully gaining independence slowly but surely. Austria wants to prevent further independent states from emerging, and Bosnia is of particular interest to them because there's a very large Serbian population that lives there as well. It is not the majority, but it's a significant minority. So they annexed this territory in 1908, and 6 years later, the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian Empire's throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife are assassinated while parading through Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. Anybody know why this is an historically significant event, other than for, the reasons of it being significant in Austrian history and significant in Bosnian history? Yes? It does not have anything to do with the French Revolution. Yes? It starts World War I. Right, so the Austrian government makes a series of demands to Serbia, knowing that it is Serbian nationalists who have done this, makes a series of demands to the Serbian government to turn over information about the assassins, allow Austria to operate essentially independently of the Serbian government on Serbian soil. Serbia says no, so Austria declares war, and that sets off a whole series of events based on alliances among countries. If Austria goes to war, Germany goes to war. If Serbia goes to war, Russia goes to war. If Russia goes to war, France goes to war. And then when Germany invades Belgium, then England goes to war. And we join in 1917, and this is the first mass conflagration of modern warfare, and the first continent-wide war in about 100 years. And it started really by this terrorist action that's undertaken in Sarajevo. And it's undertaken by members of this organization, the Black Hand, or Union or Death. So this is the perhaps the most problematic of the nationalisms of the 20th century in Europe in terms of the sheer extent of the problems that it causes. Because it's not only that this act of assassination begins World War I, but then subsequently, after World War II ends and the Cold War ends in the 90s, and the country where the Serbs live, Yugoslavia, begins to disintegrate by virtue of communism having fallen there, Serbian nationalism surges up again, and a series of wars are being fought by Serbs and their neighbors over territory. with some of the worst war crimes committed since the end of World War II being committed in this area of Europe. In fact, it goes on straight through basically until the turn of the century. Obviously, the issues that are caused by Italian nationalism, German nationalism are significantly larger in scale, but they're not nearly as long in terms of the length of time. And the problems that are caused by Zionism are caused outside of Europe by and large. So in terms of just the impact on Europe, for a small group asserting national aims, Serbian nationalism has very important effects. So if we turn to the bylaws, which are in your book on page 662, they take up 2.5 pages. Article 1, this organization is created for the purpose of realizing the national idea, the union of all Serbs. Membership is open to every Serb without distinction of sex, religion, or place of birth, and to all those who are sincerely devoted to this cause. That first article, by the way, is inherently a little confusing because Serbs are by and large identified by the virtue of their religion, membership in the Serbian Orthodox Church. People who speak the same language and are Catholics are called Croats. People who speak the same language but are Muslim are called Bosnians. So really, Serbian identity is deeply intertwined with membership in the Serbian Orthodox Church. It may be that they are sort of trying to assert a broader Serbian identity that won't be contingent on religion. The problem is that the Croats and the Bosnians have their own ideas about what it means to be Croatian and Bosnian, and so their points of view about this, particularly the Croatians, are going to be at serious odds with the Serbs on this point. The other thing to bear in mind is, so it has to do with the uniting of the Serbian people within a single political entity and government. But what right does any group have to assert its independence within a territory where they do not make up the majority? And that sort of is really what is deeply problematic about this, because it's not as if there are very clearly defined borders where the population is Serbian on one side of the border and Croatian on the other side of the border, or Serbian on one side and Albanian on the other side of the border. Instead, you have villages spread throughout the Balkans that are segregated largely on the basis of ethnicity, but that are right next to each other, and the border were to be drawn would, twist and turn and go back and forth all over the place. It would not make any sense to do that. And as a result, extracting all of the Serbian people from a particular place and uniting them within a single government could only be done if the Serbs were willing to move or the people that were not Serbian were willing to move. And that really is what undergirds the conflict here. Because if the Serbs are willing to move, that's one thing, but by and large they're not. And so they seek then to dislocate the other ethnic groups that they live among. And just in terms of terminology here, this is what is called ethnic cleansing, which, usually entails violence and killing and all of that, but not with the goal of completely eradicating the other person, just with the goal of getting them to leave. If the goal is to actually eradicate the people, regardless of where they live, then you'd call that genocide. Although the tactics may very much seem the same in these cases, the goals, the intent is quite different. So Article 2, the organization prefers terrorist action to intellectual propaganda, and for this reason it must remain absolutely secret. The organization bears the name Union or Death. To fulfill its purpose, the organization will do the following. And then it has these 5 things that it says it intends to do. First, exercise influence on government circles, on the various social classes, and on the entire social life of the Kingdom of Serbia, which is considered the Piedmont of the Serbian nation. When the organization calls Serbia, the Kingdom of Serbia, the Piedmont of the Serbian nation, it means that it is analogizing between the Kingdom of Serbia on the one hand and the area of Italy from which Mazzini and Garibaldi launched their campaign to unite all of the Italian peninsula under a single government. 2, organize revolutionary activity in all territories inhabited by Serbs. So anywhere Serbs live, they will conduct revolutionary action. Beyond the frontiers of Serbia, fight with all means the enemies of the Serbian national idea. Here that would specifically be the Austrians and the Turks. 4, maintain amicable relations with all states, peoples, organizations, and individuals who support Serbia and the Serbian element. And then finally, assist those nations and organizations that are fighting for their own national liberation and unification. With, of course, the understanding that that only applies provided that the national aspirations of these other people don't conflict with their own national aspirations. Every member has a duty to recruit new members, but the member shall guarantee with his life those whom he introduces into the organization. So we see here again this emphasis on swearing to the organization at the risk of your life. Underscoring again this point about nationalism, particularly as nationalism becomes more extreme, nationalism emphasizing the idea of the nation above the rights of the individual. It jumps to Article 25 on 663. Members of the organization are forbidden to know each other personally. Only members of the Central Committee are known to each other. Where have we seen that before? Where have we seen that idea before? You've got a central organization within the organization, and they are known to one another. But nobody in the rank and file of the organization knows who those people actually are. Yeah?
We related it to the mob, but I forget the original.
Yeah, so it's Lenin sets this out as an organizing principle with the Bolsheviks as a way of getting around the secret police. They designate their members by numbers, they say in Article 26. The Bolsheviks used noms de guerre, as they're called, war names. Lenin's last name was not really Lenin, Stalin's was not Stalin's, Trotsky's was not Trotsky. Members of the organization must absolutely obey the commands given to them by superiors. There's the recognition of the importance of a chain of command. If you don't have a chain of command in a military organization, then there is too much of a risk of insubordination, and that kind of lack of discipline can result in lack of security. Each member has to communicate to the Central Committee any information that is of interest. Article 29, very importantly, the interests of the organization stand above all other interests. And further in Article 30, which is longer, on entering the organization, each member must know that he loses his own personality, that he can expect neither personal glory nor personal profit, material or moral. Consequently, any member who endeavors to exploit the organization for personal, social, or party motives will be punished. If by his acts he harms the organization itself, the punishment will be death. Those who enter the organization may never leave it, and no one has the authority to accept a member's resignation. So the assumption is that the only way that you leave the organization is by dying. Everybody must aid the organization with weekly contributions, and the organization may procure funds through coercion. Further, when the organization declares a death penalty on a member, the only important thing it says is that it is carried out unfailingly. The method is of little importance. What is not stated here, but what is kind of implicit, is that it is the responsibility of other members of the organization to execute members of the organization who have been sentenced to death. Why might that be important, by the way, that you rely on other members of the rank and file to kill members of the rank and file when they step out of line? Yeah.
You can use like an outsider to get information.
Well, sure. I mean, you wouldn't use an outsider mainly because you are concerned about secrecy. But what effect does it have on a, particularly if you choose a person, either whether you do it at random or whether you do it by choosing a person known to the person who's been sentenced to death, what effect does it have on the membership, generally speaking? Yeah.
Like proves your loyalty.
Yeah. It proves your loyalty, and it actually has the sociological effect or psychological effect of binding the people in the rank and file closer to one another. It actually increases esprit de corps rather than decreasing it, provided that the person who is tasked with carrying out the execution actually does so. And then the rest of the articles have to do with membership seal, the membership oath, which is that they swear by the sun that shines on me, by the earth that nourishes me, by God, by the blood of my ancestors, on my honor and my life, that from this moment until my death I shall be faithful to the regulations of the organization, and that I will be prepared to make any sacrifice for it. I swear before God on my honor and on my life that I shall carry with me to the grave the organization's secrets. May God condemn me and my comrades judge me if I violate or do not respect consciously or not my oath. Anybody happen to know the mafia oath? They put take the, most of the families have a patron saint, and of course they're all Catholics, so Catholics have mass cards when people die. And it will have usually the saint that the person's named for on one side and a prayer for the dead on the other. And the mafia families have patron saints, and so they'll usually from the patron saint of the town in Sicily where the family was originally from, they'll take the mass card and they will light it on fire, and the inductee into the organization is to hold the card in his hands while saying that they pledge their loyalty to the group, and specifically the end part, may my soul burn in hell if I should ever betray them. Again, and that's the reason why I point that out, is because we were talking about Italian nationalism in the last class and the resistance of it to in the southern part of Italy, which is where the organized criminal organizations arose. They actually rose mainly in opposition to unification, and therefore, to some extent, on the basis of their own form of regionalism, if not nationalism. And these organizations, in resisting, took on the kinds of trappings that these secret nationalist organizations therefore take on, or any revolutionary organization, really. But the idea of the organization being elevated to the level of the group, to above the level of the individual, the group being above the level of the individual, is something that is not specific to nationalism, but that is certainly emphasized much more in cases where a nation is at stake. On the left, it might be class, or it might be class struggle or class consciousness that is emphasized. But on the right, and specifically on the right with regard to nationalism, it tends to be the people that are emphasized, the nation that is emphasized, and by extension, the state. So, as I mentioned, the Serbian nationalism has this effect of causing significant difficulties in Europe before World War I and culminating in World War I, and then 75 years later or so, after the Cold War ends, with the dissolution of Yugoslavia and the elevation of the conflict to ethnic cleansing. But the scale of the conflict, as opposed to the duration, is much greater when it comes from Italy and Germany, because with Italy and Germany, nationalism in the 20th century takes on the sort of the hyper-virulent form of fascism. So, in Italy, the fascist movement is led by Benito Mussolini, who actually begins on the left wing. He begins as a socialist, But like socialist parties in many countries, the Socialist Party in Italy is divided over the issue of whether or not to support the effort of going into World War I. But Mussolini is very much in favor of going into World War I, and so his wing of the Socialist Party breaks off. They don't all become fascists, but the sort of the hyper-nationalist among them do end up forming the Fascist Party, which, as noted, he does in 1914. At the end of the war, he formed something called the Italian Combat Squad. Subsequently, the National Fascist Party. He's elected to the Italian Parliament in 1919. So Italy has, by this point, a parliamentary tradition going back 50 years. Then they've got, essentially a two-party system, a centrist party, basically, called the Liberal Party, and a conservative party further to the right called the Conservative Party. And these parties basically go back and forth in terms of their governing over the country. There's the Socialist Party as well, but it doesn't have the numbers or the electoral clout to get any significant representation. Their power base is mainly among the workers. And when Mussolini is bouncing around with the Socialist Party, that's where the Socialist Party is drawing its power. What happens to Italy in World War II is that they are not initially involved in the original conflict, but they're drawn in by England and France with the promise that if they provide resistance to Austria to the south, that they will be rewarded with territory when the war is over. So Italy joins the war. They fight the Austrians. The Italian army is not particularly good. Neither is the Austrian army, but in a sort of a matching off of poorly equipped armies, the Austrian army is still better. The Italians therefore take on tremendous casualties. They are nevertheless on the winning side of the war when the dust clears, and so they do get some additional territory out of the effort. The problem is that they have expended a lot of, as they call, blood and treasure, right? They've lost many men in battles against Austria, and they have spent a ton of money. And on top of that, Europe in general undergoes a very significant economic recession at the end of the war, with countries that are less economically developed, like Italy, suffering greater than countries that are relatively advanced. So even if you end up on the winning side in the war, you are dealing with significant problems. France finds, for instance, that they've lost 500,000 men in the war, and as a result of that, they can't get their economy up and running because there's just nobody to do the work in a lot of cases. And England has financed a big portion of the war, and therefore their economy is also running pretty badly. On the losing side, it's even worse. But even being on the winning side is not so great. And so from Italy's standpoint, they call this the mutilated victory. And this causes a lot of resentment, and it's in that environment of resentment that Mussolini is able to assert a hyper-nationalist idea that basically says that he wants to take more territory than what has been apportioned to Italy as a result of the victory in the war, and establish Italy on the continent as a major power, which up until this point it has not been. It's only been a united country for 50 years. Germany has been a united country for even less, but it's actually, during that time, become a major power on the continent, so much so that the other countries on the continent had to cooperate with one another to disempower it. And so Germany is badly crippled at the end of the war because it had been so strong. Italy is badly crippled at the end of the war, but it had never been strong to begin with, and it hasn't gotten much stronger as a result of the war being on the winning side of the war. So Mussolini, although he is already in the legislature in 1921, in a deteriorating economic situation, he takes his party's paramilitary, the black shirts, and they march into Rome and demand that he be demand of the king, because remember Italy is a monarchy, that he be appointed prime minister, and he is. The sort of the threat of the appearance of of armed and well-organized men in uniform as a paramilitary organization marching on the Capitol and demanding power is enough that the king basically buckles on this point. And this begins 23 years for Mussolini being in power in Italy. So what is fascism? What is it that they are preaching as their way of doing things? So the core principle in fascism is what's called palingenetic ultranationalism. So ultranationalism is the easy part of that definition. It's just extreme nationalism, nationalism that very much elevates the nation over the individual. What palingenetic means is that this type of ultranationalism that is found in fascism tends to try to assert that its goal is to recapture some great past, whether it actually existed or not. So in the case of Italy, the way that this is expressed is that Italy should be the great power on the continent, as it was during the Roman Empire. That is the palingenesis that's being asserted. Fascist Italy should be like the Roman Empire. For the Nazis, Nazi Germany, they call themselves the Third Reich to repeat the glories of the Second Reich, the German Empire that had been abolished at the end of World War I, as well as the First Reich, the Holy Roman Empire, that confederation of German states that we talked about last time. So it is, again, a recapitulation of some great past. Anti-liberalism. So remember, liberalism is understood in the European sense is the idea of small government. So limited government and free market capitalism, basically. Fascism, it opposes both. It opposes the idea of small government because it believes in a heavily empowered state. It opposes free market capitalism because it recognizes the depredations that capitalism can have on the working class. At the same time, though, it is also deeply anti-socialist because it wants to get rid of class conflict. It asserts that the only way for classes to truly get along with each other and cooperate is by charting what it calls a third position, neither capitalist nor socialist, but something different. In individual cases, what this has actually come to be has varied greatly. But normally there has been retained some form of capitalism as well as some aspects of socialism, like a welfare state. It's anti-republican. It does not seek to establish a state that is representative of the people in terms of their actual expression of power in it. And it's anti-democratic, so it will not instill elections or have them. So it's authoritarian in that it's anti-democratic, which means that it is it seeks to establish a dictatorship where a leader, usually a single one, rules by decree. And usually the leader then amasses a cult of personality around himself, so that the sort of the reach of the government in fascist states tends to be totalitarian, to penetrate every aspect of people's lives. Fascism puts a big emphasis on traditional values, so that you have a kind of retraction of things like women's rights, and minority rights for that matter. There is militarism and usually expansion, or at least the demand for territorial expansion. And in some cases, there's what's called a corporatist economy. So as I mentioned a few moments ago, it says that fascists try to assert a third position that is neither capitalist nor socialist. In certain cases, in Italy to a limited extent, and in other sort of quasi-fascist states like Spain under Franco, Portugal under Salazar, Austria before the Nazis annexed it, they did this much more. They instituted a system called corporatism where they set up bodies that are overseen by government that are representative of different interest groups. So the workers will have a corporation, as they call it, within that system. The managers will have a corporation within that system. And overseen by the government, they will make deals. But as I mentioned before as well, there is nevertheless usually significant remnants of capital that's left in the hands of private industry, usually because they're complicit with whatever the state is doing. You had, for instance, in Nazi Germany, industrialists like the Krupp family and the Porsche family making big sweetheart deals with the government and getting rewarded with big fat contracts, and then once the war started, with slave laborers to boot. But what the government did not do was take over industry. So in Germany, the fascist movement, National Socialism, is brought in by Adolf Hitler. And National Socialism is a combination of fascism plus a deeply racial aspect. So fascism under Mussolini, in his version, does not incorporate a significant racial aspect to it. For one thing, although the Italian ethnicity as it is relatively heterogeneous in terms of dialect and to some extent culture, the only thing that that Mussolini does is impose a strict national dialect on the country, his own, of course, and then and minimize to a certain extent then the number of dialects that are spoken. But in terms of ethnic minorities, there are not significant numbers of them. There's a German-speaking community in the north, but their interests are looked out for by the German-speaking countries that neighbor them. And by and large, because of their isolation where they are in the Alps, they're pretty much left alone. There's a small Jewish community in Italy, but it's actually pretty loyal to Mussolini because he protects their interests as well. So you don't have in Italy the kind of suppression of minorities that you see in National Socialist Germany. Hitler's own background is military. He's Austrian by descent, moves to Germany when World War I breaks out so that he can join the German army. He is decorated twice in the army and then goes into military intelligence when the war is over. And it's as a member of military intelligence, particularly political intelligence, that he infiltrates this small party, this tiny little right-wing, very racist party called the German Workers' Party, and within a couple of years takes it over, renames it, designs their flag and their uniforms, and they're off to the races. His seizure of power in Germany is much more difficult, however. Unlike Mussolini, who's able to just march into the capital and demand of the king that he be appointed the prime minister. When Hitler tries this in 1923, he is miserably unsuccessful. He is arrested, tried for treason, found guilty, and sentenced to 5 years in prison, but he only serves less than 2 years and is subsequently freed. So, but he does say that after that point, he will only seek to seize power through democratic means. So he's freed from prison in 1925. He comes to power 8 years later, and it's not a straight line for him to get there. He writes Mein Kampf while he's in prison, and he publishes in 1925, and as you are probably aware of that book, at least by name. We'll look at it in a lot more detail when we talk specifically about racism as an ideology. What's important about it here is that the attempt at the coup has made him famous, and the publishing of this book makes him wealthy. He never has to work again. He can devote himself entirely to politics after this point. Germany itself, as I mentioned earlier, it loses World War I. And as a result of losing World War I, its monarchy, which has been in power there for almost 50 years, is abolished, and it becomes a republic. This happens not so much because the German army has been demolished or anything like that. In fact, the war's been fought to a standstill, but the German army is still armed and still basically ready to fight. The generals haven't really given up. They've begun talking about negotiating some kind of peace. But it isn't until there are widespread mutinies in the German army and the navy that a revolution actually sweeps over the country. In a couple of places, in Munich and in Berlin, this takes the form of the attempt to establish Soviet-style governments, but these do not last very long. The new government, led by a party called the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the SPD, uses recently demobilized soldiers who have sort of banded together in small paramilitary organizations to overthrow these short-lived communist governments. And by 1919, the situation politically has stabilized. The government has been formed, the democratic government led by the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which is a center-left political party, which is still a major political party in Germany today. It's in fact the oldest political party in Europe that still operates, with the exception, I think, of the Conservative Party in England. The problem is that the economic situation in Germany is horrendous. The first thing that happens is that Germany is saddled by the Treaty of Versailles that ends World War I with reparations payments mainly to France. France has been, not only has it lost 500,000 men, but it's also had a big chunk of its infrastructure destroyed, and it wants payback because it's been on the winning side. The problem is that Germany doesn't have the money to pay the reparations. And so they make the very bad mistake of generating more currency just to pay these reparations. And if you've taken an introductory economics course, when you increase the money supply without adding any real value, you get inflation. When you do it a bunch, you get hyperinflation. So what happens in Germany is that their currency gets devalued very quickly, so that, you know, like a whole wheelbarrow full of money has to be brought to a store to buy groceries. And on one hand, that's hugely inconvenient and all of that, but the sort of the bigger implications are like what it does to people's savings, which is that it basically wipes them out. So that people are deeply concerned about their future. This is on top of the country's prestige having been lost as a result of losing the war. They've had their industry severely cut back. They have to give most of their iron and coal production to France as part of the reparations on top of giving them money. And so Germany spirals completely out of control, economically speaking. When Germany finally basically throws up its hands and says it won't make the payments anymore because it can't, there's a brief military showdown with France, but in the end, the United States comes back and bails everybody out. We come in and we provide stable currency for Germany, something called the Dawes Plan. And between 1924 and 1929, Germany's economy stabilizes. It stabilizes, in fact, so well that although there's a ban on the Nazi Party for 5 years, when they are able to run in an election again, which happens in 1928, they come in like 8th place out of 9. So there's no interest among the voting population in voting for the Nazi Party, for voting in a party of the far right, a nationalist party that is hostile to democracy. Instead, the big parties in Germany are the Social Democratic Party, which is still the ruling party. They've got a large centrist, Catholically oriented political party called the Center, and they've got a liberal party in the center called the German Liberal Party. And those parties basically govern as a coalition this whole time. The good news about the economic stabilization is that when the stock market crashes in New York in October of 1929, it wipes out basically the economies all over the world, because it's the United States, in particular in Europe, that's been doing the stabilizing by extending credit. When we don't have any money, we can't extend credit. So we pull back our credit, and the European economies spiral out of control again. And that's when Germany really falls into it. The first election that's held after the crash, the Nazis come in second place. So they rise in 2 years from being a tiny minority party to being the second largest party in the country. And the other thing that happens, which is important to bear in mind, is that the Communist Party in Germany rises to third place. So despite this stabilization of the country through this plan, it isn't long enough for people to get any real confidence in the government to manage things properly. And so when they're given the opportunity to vote after the stock market crashes, the majority of the people vote for governments, for parties that are dedicated to destroying democracy. Both the Communist Party, which is basically run from Moscow, and the Nazi Party are explicit in their desire to get rid of democratic government in Germany. Later in 1932, the president, Paul von Hindenburg, a World War I general and a war hero, comes up for re-election, and he is challenged by Hitler in that election. In that election, Hitler comes in second place. The communist candidate comes in third in that election. And then, because the government's become really unstable in Germany, with the parties in the parliament being hostile to the continuing democratic process, they're constantly filing no-confidence motions against the governments, with elections being called twice in 1932. In both of those elections, the Nazis get the largest number of votes. They get a plurality, around 40% in both of those elections. The Communist Party also gains in votes again as well. And what's happening in Germany at this point is that because the governments are so unstable and because their constitution allows it, the president has been just appointing prime ministers and allowing them to govern without consulting the legislature at all. So democracy ends basically in Germany before Hitler gains actual power. The problem with that is that it's difficult to maintain a situation where your largest political party is not being given the opportunity to rule. And so after sort of putting it off for as long as they can, the president and his closest advisors agree in January of 1933 that they will give Hitler an opportunity to act as the country's chancellor, as its prime minister. They think, everybody else has failed at it, he'll fail too. And that furthermore, because he doesn't have an outright majority, he'll have to form a coalition of other parties, and they'll hem him in. So he's made the chancellor in 1933. But the communists give him a big assist. They burn down the parliament building the following month. And as a result of this, Hitler is able to gain something from the president called the Enabling Act, which gives him the right to rule by decree, and then he just never convenes the parliament again, basically. So within 3 months of Hitler coming into power as chancellor, in a still basically democratic process, he manages to gain almost complete control over the state. And then the political repression begins. So first, the Communist Party and the Socialist Party are outlawed. And within a year, all the other political parties are outlawed. And he On top of it, when the president dies, he just names himself president, so now he's both the head of government and the head of state. And then repression against minorities begins in earnest as well. So beginning a few months after he comes into power, his party begins to pass laws against the Jewish minority, which is less than 1% of the population, as well as already noted, political opponents who are largely thrown into concentration camps. They opened the first concentration camp in Germany 2 months after Hitler takes power, and it's mainly to put communists and socialists into, as well as religious dissidents, mainly Jehovah's Witnesses, but also Catholic and Protestant clergy who have spoken out against the regime. Homosexuals are targeted as well, any people that are foreign that don't hold German citizenship. And the other thing that he does is he institutes, first secretly and then quite openly, he flagrantly violates the Treaty of Versailles and begins to rearm the country, such that he's able actually to recover the German economy, because when you just decide you're going to spend all of your government capital on building weapons, that creates jobs. And on top of it, if you are a radical traditionalist and you insist that any women that are working go back into the house and have children, that's going to create jobs for men as well. So the two countries, by the way, that don't, by and large, after 1933, experience the deepest lows of the Depression in the middle of the 30s in Europe are Germany, because it's rearming, and the Soviet Union, because, as we talked about when we talked about Stalin, they've undertaken this radical system of industrialization and collectivizing of their farms, which again just shows if you're willing to, throw human misery at a problem, you can usually solve it. In addition to the rearming, they begin then to also reincorporate lost territory. And they also enact an enormous security apparatus with multiple police bureaus, including the Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret state police, or Gestapo. So despite the fact that Hitler hates communism and hates the communists and hates the Bolsheviks in particular, because as far as he's concerned, they're a Jewish organization, he very much admires their way of governing in terms of having total control, using secret police, and not being afraid to use violence. So he takes that particular lesson, but he institutes a very radical regime. The territorial demands get much more contentious when he begins then to demand territory that had not been Germany's before the war. First Austria, then the German-speaking parts of Czechoslovakia, which he is given in both cases by the international community. Then he just outright marches into the rest of Czechoslovakia in March of 1939, and then he begins making territorial demands against Poland. And with the demand on Poland, people say they've had enough. If you move against Poland, they say we're going to war, and they do. Right, and this is the Second World War. We tend to think about it from our standpoint in the United States as being something that is half of the war, with the war against Japan being the other half, and with our focus in the war against Germany being very much on the war against England and France. But the lion's share of the war is actually fought in the East between the Soviet Union and the Nazis, where they fight brutal ideological, a war of extermination, as the Nazis call it. And the Nazis are clear in their goals here. They're looking to destroy communism, establish a large empire for the expansion of their people, and to, they say, establish a new order for Europe where they will be the eminent power on the continent. So, whereas for Mussolini in Italy, there is the establishment of a fascist government there is minimal expansion. They take on colonies in Libya and Ethiopia, but otherwise don't expand beyond that, at least until the war begins. For Germany, expansion is on the table right away. It's an explicit goal that they're stating as part of their program. And when they do so with absolutely zero regard for the rights of the people upon whose territory they are expanding. Because what National Socialism and Hitler in particular do is add this very essential component of racism to an already toxic ideology of ultranationalism. So it's not only therefore that that our ethnic group, our national group is better, but it's that yours is clearly much worse. And so it's not just a matter of you being below us, it's that you are so below us that you're not fit to live amongst us. Now we'll talk about that in more detail when we talk about racism, but the short version is that, the war does not go good for Italy and Germany. They both lose. They both lose their fascist governments, and they both, they both are turned into democracies, mainly by the United States. In the case of Germany, that is highly advantageous, it turns out. Although the country is divided as part of the Cold War, the Soviets occupy the eastern third of the country, the United States occupies the western third. They also divide Berlin. And of course, the Soviets also established satellite states in Eastern Europe. We established satellite states in Western Europe under NATO, theirs under the Warsaw Pact. For the countries that are allied with us, and very particularly for Germany, it makes out really well in the deal. They lose millions of men in the war, and that's obviously tremendously tragic for the country. And of course, we also destroy the country. It's completely flattened at the end of the war. We also then dump billions and billions and billions of dollars back into Germany to rebuild it. And we make it into this sort of like paragon of liberal democracy. Whereas in East Germany, the Soviets are in control there, and they have, what the Soviets have everywhere. They've got a stagnated socialist economy, and nobody has any freedom, and everybody hates it. So, but Germany, reunites after the end of the Cold War, and they've done pretty well. Fascism, therefore, it is sort of this blip that comes up in the history, not just of Europe or the world, but sort of more importantly in the history of nationalism by and large, right? I mean, it's not as if nationalism has gone away, either kind, right? Civic nationalism as we have here, or ethnic nationalism as a lot of other countries have, or for that matter, ethnic nationalism as apparently we have here now as well. But the point is that for those countries that have sought to moderate their nationalism and not allow the worst instincts of nationalism to be expressed, they have done better. Arguably, they've done best, at least of those countries that are defined on the basis of nationhood. Now, it's also true that, these are countries that have, the situation at the end of World War II was very different from the situation at the end of World War I. At the end of World War I, Europe was divided up into countries on the basis of the national idea. This was President Wilson's famous 14 points. President Wilson suggests a peace for Europe at the end of World War I and says that the governing principle should be the independence of peoples, that states should be organized in Central and Eastern Europe on the basis of nationhood. The problem with that is that the situation in Serbia, where many Serbs live outside the borders of their country, that's not unique. And so although there are big clumps of people in places and you can draw borders pretty well, you're going to leave significant minorities outside of those borders after World War I. That goes very well into feeding nationalism for two reasons. First of all, you have minorities that feel oppressed, either because they genuinely are oppressed or because they're just minorities and feel therefore inferior in a sort of more theoretical way. They begin to feel nationalism, with that nationalism being more vehemently expressed when the oppression that they feel is real, and particularly when it's violent. Conversely, you have situations emerging where there are states that where the majority becomes hyper-nationalist because the minorities that live among them are better equipped economically. And so you have situations emerging where, for instance, in Hungary and in Romania and in Poland to a lesser extent, but in the Baltic states as well, you have countries where the national majority is usually between 50 and 75% of the population. And then you've got several other minorities making up significant minorities. But these minorities have traditionally been economically much better advantaged than the majority has been. Because these are countries with less development, their majorities are by and large still peasants, still tenant farmers. They've got intellectualized elites that have national movements on their mind, and they live in the cities and they organize nationalist parties. They're setting up language academies and the whole sort of thing that nationalist parties do. But in these countries, they also have German landed gentries that own large estates. So the tenant farmers are actually not farming for people of their own ethnicity. They're farming for Germans that have owned the land for hundreds of years. For some of these countries, they've been under Russian rule, and so their bureaucrats are all Russian-speaking rather than the national majority. In many of these countries, they have upwardly mobile and highly affluent Jewish minorities living in their cities as well, who are far better off economically than the peasants are. All this causes tremendous animosity. Because after all, after World War I, as already pointed out, the economic situation is in the basket. Everybody's suffering. And when you are suffering economically, the target of your unhappiness is most often going to be the person nearest you who's doing better, and it's going to help for you to focus that animosity if they speak a different language than you do, or they look different from you, or they practice a different religion than you do. Then you can really focus your animosity. It'll even help if you didn't like them to begin with, right? So if you can draw economic lines on the basis of ethnicity, and in these countries that's really, really easy to do, then you're going to get nationalism being expressed by both sides in usually in very violent ways. And that's exactly what happens. The worst examples are with Italy and Germany, where ironically the minorities are rather small, and so they're able to establish rule relatively easily, and they're able to then sort of establish a firm grip over the country until they end up going into other people's countries, violating agreements, and evoking international response in the form of full-out European or worldwide war. And that's what brings down these movements more than anything else. The fact that they push their hand too far. But the question to consider is whether or not that is a natural result of what happens when nationalism is expressed in its sort of most vehement form. Because remember that particularly with the ethnic form of nationalism, there remains this issue of what rights minorities have within a society that is organized under the principle of ethnic nationalism. If you're not organized under the principle of ethnic nationalism, then it doesn't matter. You might have to deal with forms of prejudice that are expressed in different ways culturally or societally, but hopefully it won't enter the political calculation. But when the first line of your constitution is that your country is the nation of the X people, whatever it happens to be, which virtually all the constitutions of these countries begin with, that immediately should evoke the question in the minds of minorities, well, what about us? And of course they can say, well, that very same constitution might say that the country recognizes the rights of everybody without regard to nationality, because all of these constitutions say that as well. But what languages are they going to be teaching in schools? What religions are going to have recognition from the state versus the ones that don't? What language is the national anthem going to be in? Is there a situation where this can work? Because in most cases, particularly when conflict emerges as a result of it, the situation gets worse rather than better. So the situation I'm thinking of right now is the one in Israel, right? So you've got this nationalist movement of deeply oppressed people, and their oppression, it peaks during World War II, so much so that their national movement gains tremendous sympathy as a result of that, and the remnant of that population is successfully settled into a state in Palestine. And since 1948, there's been a Jewish state in Palestine. The problem with that is that since its very founding, anywhere between 10 and 25% of the population has not been Jewish. This is the indigenous Arab population of Palestine. Now, Israel has always stated, first, that it is the nation state of the Jewish people, and second, that it recognizes everybody's rights. The problem with that is that they have discovered, very much so over the course of the last 15 or 20 years, but certainly even since the beginning, that making that actually the case has been very difficult. So Israel has always recognized both Hebrew and Arabic as national languages. It has always recognized freedom of religion. It has always recognized equality under the law, at least on paper. But the Arab population was kept under martial law for the first 10 years that the country existed. Now, this is justified on the basis of the fact that they had just fought a protracted war against that very population to establish the state in the first place. But can you actually maintain that you are a democracy of all of your people and do that? Moreover, just 3 or 4 months ago, they actually retracted their statement that Arabic is one of the official languages in the country, because their government has actually moved in a much more hyper-nationalist direction over the course of the last 15 or 20 years. And that's been expressed in their policy. I'm not even talking about the occupation in the West Bank or in East Jerusalem or in the Gaza Strip. We're talking about Arabs that live in Israel itself, whose recognition as being equal under the law is now being drawn back. It's an interesting case to consider because it is a very much emblematic of a situation in which nationalism emerges in the first place as the direct result of severe oppression, but in which then the empowered group, national group in this case, the Jewish people, but really more appropriately and correctly the Israeli people now, the Jewish Israeli people, that their position as a majority has resulted in their very palpably becoming a people that oppresses another people. Is it possible to erect any state on national principle that doesn't do that? And there are other examples. I mean, they're not all ones that are splashed across the newspapers every night either. In a lot of countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union, the rights of Russian-speaking people are not the same as the majorities are. So that although there are very large populations of Russian-speaking people in all 15 of these countries that were once part of the Soviet Union, Russian is not an official language in most of them. In a lot of the places, unless the Russian people can demonstrate that their ancestry in that country goes back 100 years, they don't have voting rights. And again, these are all countries that state that they are the nation state of X people, whatever their majority is, and further state that that everybody in the country is recognized as being equal, regardless of nationality or ethnicity. And yet, because of their experience of being under Russian domination, they've decided that their way of doing things is going to be to severely, I would say, at least as far as democratic principles are concerned, severely circumscribe the rights of the Russian-speaking population in those countries. And very much like the case with Israel and the Palestinians, they can justify it on the basis of having fought these people. Right? We have to keep the Arabs under martial law for 10 years because we just finished fighting them. But at what point do you have to relinquish the idea that you can have an ethnically based democracy and have or an ethnically based nation rather, and have a fully fledged democracy where everybody actually has all of the same rights? A couple of countries do this, but they do it only by writing constitutions that are very explicit in recognizing the rights of each group specifically. So Belgium is a country where there are 3 ethnic groups. There's the Walloons that speak French, there are the Flemings that speak Dutch, and there are Germans in the eastern part of the country. And they all have very clearly recognized rights under the Constitution, such that one group can never dominate the other groups. Right? It's a situation called power sharing. And even there still is tension between these two groups. Even in a country like Canada, which has decided that it's going to recognize the rights of 10% of the population that doesn't speak English by giving them equal rights in virtually everything, guaranteeing and ensconcing those rights in their constitution, insisting that every publication that come out of their government be in 2 languages for the benefit of the 10% that don't speak English, but that speak French. So they have gone sort of over and above to maintain democracy to the extent of perhaps recognizing overly the importance of this particular French-speaking minority in Canada. But without some kind of, it seems to me, and I'm not suggesting I'm right, I'm just suggesting that I had this opinion. It seems to me that it is quite difficult to truly maintain a democracy where everybody is equal if you define the country on the basis of something that everybody can't become if they want to. Right? Your thoughts? Any thoughts? Did I tell you that the president would begin to talk about taking away the citizenship of people born here who were not born as citizens? Did I nail that? Who owes me, what is it, like $10,000? You divide that by 22, you could probably get that. It probably wouldn't be difficult. I came in early on that one. I couldn't even believe it. And now he's going to be sending the army down to, I mean, you do realize what he's doing is he's whipping up his base, right? And what can we say about President Trump's base? Because the president's base is not his party, by the way. I want to be clear about that. The president's base is within his party. The president's base is a subset of his political party. But it's not his party at large. There's a lot of his party that doesn't like him. But the president commands the white nationalist base of the Republican Party. That is a foregone conclusion at this point. Because when he is trying to whip up his base, he goes to race. What you don't see them doing is deploying 15,000 troops to the northern border where white people live. It is a very clear, not even a dog whistle. It's a bullhorn to his people that if they don't come out and vote for him and his party and the people that he particularly favors, that it's not going to be a white country. But here's the secret. It's not going to be a white country anyway. That ship sailed. So what you're seeing in this particular case, by the way, and I don't think it's a majority of Republicans, I know it's not a majority of Americans, but it certainly is the base for the president. And whether the president actually believes any of it, or whether he just activates this particular base because it's reliable for him, I don't know. But that particular base falls very much into what we've been talking about tonight and in the last class. This is a group that feels threatened because they are. I mean, it's not a matter of them being worried about losing their status. They are losing their status in the majority of these countries. And so they are lashing out. And unfortunately, they are being given political voice to do that at this point. And so for the first time since the 60s, we have people in high political office that are whipping up a racially nationalist form of politics in this country. We always have racial politics in the United States, don't get me wrong. It's just that people are usually much more subtle about it. And therefore, it doesn't have that mobilizing effect that sort of the overt racist statements have. Right? It's one thing for a political party to talk about how they want to maintain law and order and talk about, you know, that they're going to cut welfare, and everybody sort of knows on one level that what that means is that darker skinned people are taking your hard-earned money and they're getting welfare out of it. That's one thing. It's another thing for George Wallace to say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Right? There's no mistaking what that is. And so for the first time since Wallace, that's what we're getting now. The president is at least, I don't want to say smart enough, but he's at least not saying he is a white nationalist, but he is saying he is a nationalist. And if you caught him on his worst day, I think he would be tongue-tied to explain what that means, if not something racial. I don't think that he would be able to express it. Yeah.
Do you think this whole situation that he brought up with like the citizenship and stuff could have like a future upheaval in economics between like international countries that America works with?
I think that it's, well, here, so the only real sort of mechanism by which we could ever face like sanction for a policy like that would be through the UN, but we have the right to veto everything in the UN, so no. I mean, like, you know, I mean, why were we, like, when this country was, like, you know, publicly hanging black men in public squares, you know, like, throughout the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, we were being excoriated by other countries, but nobody was bringing sanctions against us because they couldn't. Nor did it happen in the 50s and 60s with the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, think about this, you know, we successfully put sanctions on South Africa to such an extent that they actually had to get rid of their form of apartheid there. Nobody can do that to us because we hold all the cards. I mean, it's not even just a matter of our power. It's that we have an actual veto in the UN. So, you know, why weren't the Soviets sanctioned in the UN for everything they did that was terrible, you know, after 1945? They had a veto in the UN. Why wasn't China sanctioned after shooting people in Tiananmen Square for demonstrating for democracy? You've got a veto in the UN. Same thing. So will we face any real consequences? Not legally. Will countries maybe not want to do business with us? It's hard to say. I mean, we are, after all, still the largest economy and the second largest producer. You know, they just elected an overt fascist as president of Brazil. I don't know if you guys are aware of that. 2 days ago, they actually elected a fascist in Brazil. And what they did not experience as a result of that was capital flight. What they experienced was people saying, hey, here's a guy we can do business with. So no, we probably will not face any serious economic consequences. And frankly, I mean, it's not like the country's going to change either. I mean, you know, whatever happens with this administration happens. But it's still not going to be a white country in 20 years. Nobody can change that. So, I mean, this might be their sort of their death throes in trying this, but their chances of actually succeeding at it are slim to none. It's just the question of how difficult they can make life for everybody else while they're trying. So, we're just about out of time. So we will do review on Tuesday.